morning. Good afternoon, really. Thank you for coming today. I almost don't know what to say. What a fabulous turnout. Thank you. Now, when this wonderful new library became more than a germ of an idea, our capital campaign began. Once in a lifetime, a community builds a library. 1,656 families generously donated $24 million to help make this a reality. And contributions to the annual campaign make programs like this a reality. With Wings Like Eagles, A History of the Battle of Britain is already being considered the only book that completely describes the political maneuvering and behind-the-scenes strategizing that surrounded the Battle of Britain. A book that belongs permanently in any history collection. Its author, who served as an RAF pilot himself and who is here today, tells the story with understanding, passion, and authority. The tales of pilots, ground crews, and commanders on both sides allow him to write with that authority. He is an author that we trust. He is the former editor-in-chief of Simon & Schuster and author of Horse People, Country Matters, Ulysses S. Grant, Cat People, Journey to a Revolution, the best-selling Ike, An American Hero, and my personal favorite, His Very Personal Charmed Lives. A little more than a year ago, we were honored to host a program that featured today's speaker. Grateful that it was not a once-in-a-lifetime event, we are overjoyed to welcome back to the Darien Library, Mr. Michael Korda.
I thought that the old library was wonderful, but this one is terrific. It's very impressive. Before I even begin to tell you about With Wings Like Eagles and the Battle of Britain, let me start by saying, particularly for those in the audience who are younger, that this country has been blessed since 1945 by fighting wars that were, to begin with, a long way away. And also wars in which the outcome was not necessarily decisive. Had we lost the war in Korea, and as it was a draw, that did not mean that the Koreans would have arrived here and forced us all to eat kimchi. We never risked being invaded. The war was distant. It was possible to be ambivalent about the war, and many people were, about the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and to feel that we ought not to be fighting it, or that we were supporting the wrong people. It was possible to feel that, and many people did, about the war in Iraq. I am sure that many people feel it with some apprehension about the war in Afghanistan. But to think about the Battle of Britain, you have to forget that series of wars altogether, and imagine yourself to be in a war which, if it's lost, will cost you everything, and where the enemy is not 5,000 or 10,000 miles away, but 20 miles away across the channel, and where defeat will mean the unthinkable. It's necessary to say that because it has been so long since the United States has been in that position. The Civil War is probably the last war which might have led to an America that would be totally unrecognizable today, one broken up into at least two nations and maybe more, one in which foreign European powers might have reestablished themselves in parts of America as colonial powers. The future would be very different, and we would be living in a radically different world. Needless to say, if events had turned out other than they did between May and October of 1940, we would be living in a world so unimaginably worse than the one we are living in now, under repression so much savagely worse than anything, thankfully, that we can imagine, that it scarcely bears thinking upon. But this, before we even begin to think about the Battle of Britain, is something that we all need to remind ourselves of. I don't need to expand on the notion of Nazi Germany and how very dangerous it was, but it's at the center of it. And without understanding that, it's not possible to understand either the high drama or the great importance or the enormous benefit of the Battle of Britain. Myself, I've always been interested in the Battle of Britain, not surprisingly, since a good deal of it took place over my head when I was a child in England, age 7. And I knew a lot of people who fought in it then and later on when I was grown up. It was no accident that when it came time to do my national service at the age of 17 and a half, I joined the Royal Air Force myself. You didn't get a choice, of course, but I begged my father and his friend Brendan Bracken, a member of Parliament and one of Churchill's closest friends and advisors, to get me into the RAF. My father, who had served in the Austro-Hungarian infantry in World War I on the Carpathian front, was willing enough to do anything which would keep me out of the army and the trenches, both of which he had himself disliked very much. So numerous air marshals were called and taken to lunch at Prunier's on my behalf, and I ended up spending 2.5 years in the Royal Air Force. Quite happy ones looking back on it. To this day, I get a thrill just looking at an aircraft close-up, or from shading my eyes and looking at one high in the sky and trying to decide what it is. We live in Dutchess County, New York, and from time to time we get a big Air Force C-5A flying over our farm, lowering its wheels and its flaps to land at Stewart Field outside Newburgh, and I'm always awed by its sheer size and majesty. Getting close to airplanes I like even better. There's something about the smell of aviation fuel, burned rubber, and hot metal that I still find exciting 58 years after hanging around airplanes while my father and David Lean made the sound barrier with Ann Todd and Ralph Richardson, the year I joined the Royal Air Force. I managed then to cater a ride in the de Havilland Comet, the first jet-powered airliner, and in the back seat of a Supermarine Swift jet fighter, and I can still remember every moment. In those days, 1951, it had been only 11 years since the Battle of Britain, and the Royal Air Force was still full of people who had experienced it at first hand, whether as aircrew or on the ground. There was a Polish flight lieutenant at my recruit training depot with most of his face burned off, his burned hands covered with black cotton gloves, who had won a distinguished service order and a distinguished flying cross-flying Spitfires, and wore the small gold bar with the words Battle of Britain engraved on it on the ribbon of his 1939-1945 service star. Some of the older NCOs and warrant officers had been air gunners toward the end of the war. Jaunty phrases from the unique slang of the wartime RAF were still in unself-conscious daily use. Bloody good show, piece of cake, bang on, wizard prang, tail end Charlie. Aircraftmen were irks. To wait was to stooge about. Duff Gen was bad information. Pucka Gen was the real thing. Blast off meant fed up. A kite was an aeroplane. Press the tit was the command to hurry up. The Brill Cream Boys, named after the famous brand of men's hair cream, were us, of course, members of the Royal Air Force, the mob, as opposed to blue jobs, the Navy, and brown jobs, the Army. So I began early on reading whatever I could about the battle and talking to those who had fought in it on both sides, for the Royal Air Force eventually sent me to Germany. I read Richard Hillary's classic book about his experience as a Battle of Britain fighter pilot, The Last Enemy, with close attention because he was reputed to have been a lover of my Auntie Merle's, despite the fact that he was a guinea pig, a patient of the legendary Dr. McEnroe of the Queen Victoria Burns Institute at East Grinstead, the plastic surgeon who specialized in those airmen whose face had been burned off when their plane caught fire, always referred to as guinea pigs, both because the endless painful surgery was experimental, and because their faces, even when rebuilt, were smooth and hairless, with no lips, vestigial noses and ears. Hillary, a charismatic, handsome, and intellectual undergraduate at Trinity College, Oxford, had joined the Royal Air Force, shot down 5 Germans, then hit himself. He parachuted from his burning Spitfire, losing his nose, his lips, his ears, most of the flesh off his hands. And it always fascinated me that he may have found a brief period of happiness with my exquisitely glamorous, beautiful, and fastidious Aunt Merle Oberon before going back to flying duties and getting killed in 1942. I met and became a friend of the ace Peter Townsend, Group Captain Peter Downson, TSO, DFC and Bar, who nearly married Princess Margaret but was prevented from doing so because of his divorce, and who was one of the most glamorous survivors of the Battle of Britain. And I also met the remarkable Group Captain Douglas Bader, CBE, DSO and Bar, DFC and Bar, the legless ace who shot down 22 German aircraft. I read everything I could about the Battle of Britain, and even wangled my way up in a Spitfire, converted into a 2-seat trainer for the Irish Air Force after the war, just to hear the snarl of the famous 12-cylinder, 27-liter Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. To give you some idea of how big that is, the biggest car engine today in the BMW or the Mercedes-Benz is 6 liters. And to feel what it was like to fly in that small, sensitive, graceful aircraft, which inspired Pilot Officer Philip McGee in High Flight to write, "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds, and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up in the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent lifting mind I've trod the high and trespass sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God." There is a beauty and poetry to airplanes and flying, but the Battle of Britain was a battle, with all that entails: suffering, heroism, tragic mistakes, death. Pilot Officer Philip McGee, the young poet I have just quoted, was killed in the air at the age of 21, a brilliant talent snuffed out in his youth, like so many of the First World War poets. For all the romantic, devil-may-care glamour of fighter pilots, when we see them in the old photographs, many of them, most of them, were dead before they reached 21. What sets the Battle of Britain apart from the ordinary slog of warfare is the fact that so few people fought in it. We are used to thinking about history in terms of mass numbers, ignoring the fact that sometimes the great historical turning points involve very few people indeed. It has always been so. 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC held off the vast army of the Persian king Xerxes and prevented Europe from being engulfed by Asia. Only 75 Massachusetts militiamen faced 250 British regulars on the morning of April 19, 1775 on Lexington Common for the shot that was heard around the world. But they were enough to provoke a war and the birth of a new nation. History, despite what Napoleon said, does not always favor the big battalions. Within my own lifetime, and that of a few other people I can see here tonight, History was changed by fewer than 1,000 men, for as the British faced the threat of German invasion after the defeat of France and the evacuation of what remained of the British Army from Dunkirk at the end of May 1940, that was the average daily number of fighter pilots that RAF Fighter Command had with which to defend the United Kingdom. From July through September of 1940, the number of fighter pilots dropped on some days to less than 900. And the grand total of pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain, as it came to be called, from the end of July to the end of September, would total just over 3,000, more than a third of whom were killed. Never in the field of human conflict, Winston Churchill said of them in the House of Commons on August 20th, 1940, has so much been owed by so many to so few. And so it is that those who fought in the Battle of Britain are, and no doubt always will be, referred to as the few. Not only did Churchill provide them with their epitaph, he also coined the name of their fight, when on June 18, 1940, the day that France formally surrendered to Germany, he said in the House of Commons, "What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves, that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. Their finest hour, the few. These are the phrases that have rung through the decades, and surely always will so long as Britain lasts. But although the few have been glamorized and romanticized, who were these Royal Air Force pilots? And those on the ground who supported them, many of them young airwomen, who took their full share of casualties and won many medals for bravery under fire. Who led them, and how was this battle, seemingly against such hopeless odds, eventually won? Fighter pilots in general have a reputation for dash and cheerful bravery, and the pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain were certainly no exception. But all the dash and bravery in the world would not have saved Britain if Royal Air Force Fighter Command had not been prepared for war when it came. For that is the key to the story, that despite lamentable gaps in British rearmament during the 1930s, despite the apparent timidity of British governments from 1933 when Hitler took power in Germany to 1940, the British were nevertheless prepared in the two areas that would matter most to them: the sea, where the Royal Navy still ruled the waves, and the air over the English Channel, Kent, and Sussex, which the Luftwaffe would have to control before a German invasion of Britain could be launched. Over time, every great victory is subject to doubt and debunking, and the Battle of Britain is no exception. There are those who have argued that Hitler was never serious about invading Britain in the first place, and those who have argued that even if he was serious, the Royal Navy would have destroyed his invasion fleet. Perhaps so. But the German preparations for the invasion were much more thorough than most people seem to believe. And as for the Royal Navy, events only 15 months later, when Japanese aircraft sank the modern British battleships HMS Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales off the coast of Malaya, as well as most of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, would demonstrate just how vulnerable big warships are to aerial attack, particularly in narrow waters. And at its narrowest point, the English Channel is only 21 miles wide. If the Germans could have used the full strength of their air force to protect their invasion fleet, and by July 1940 the three German air fleets assembled to attack Britain had almost 3,000 modern aircraft, Who can say how long the Royal Navy's home fleet would have survived constant air attacks? But of course these attacks could never have been carried out so long as the airspace over the Channel in southern England was controlled by the British. Sorry. Thus, when it came to the invasion, the German armed services played the equivalent of that old music hall parody of French politeness, "After you, Alphonse." The German army was ready to go as soon as the German Navy was ready. The German Navy was ready to go as soon as the German Air Force had swept the skies clear of British aircraft. So it was therefore up to the Luftwaffe to go first. The German Air Force fought through August and September to destroy Fighter Command, and on several days came with it a hair's breadth of success. But what stood in their way was the calm and brilliant leadership of one remarkable man, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief of Fighter Command, who had painstakingly created over the years the elements that led to British victory in the Battle of Britain. Radar, the 8-gun all-metal monoplane fighter, and the system of fighter control operations that linked by buried underground telephone cables and by very high-frequency radio, all these elements together under his direct command. Dowding did all this against the odds, for it was the prevailing view of his fellow air marshals that, to quote, "the bomber will always get through," unquote. And that the only way to protect Britain from an air attack was by creating a bomber force so powerful that no country would dare attack us. What we would now call a policy of retaliation or deterrence. Money spent on fighters, the Air Council told the government, was money down the drain. Only the biggest bomber force could guarantee Britain's safety. Very fortunately, Dowding did not believe a word of this. He understood that while fighter aircraft could not win a war, for lack of them a war could be lost in a single day. And he worked with energy and foresight to prepare Britain for that day, drawing up as early as 1931 the Air Ministry specifications for a new fighter that would produce the Hawker Hurricane in 1935 and the Supermarine Spitfire in 1936. He not only pushed hard for Robert Watson Watt's research on radar in 1935, he made elaborate plans to construct radar stations covering all of southern and eastern Britain. He set in motion the recruiting of young women to become radar operators and to staff the operations room of Fighter Command, and even to train young women as pilots so that they could deliver the fighter planes directly from the factory to the squadrons every day. He made the decision to arm his new fighters with 8 machine guns, since he calculated that the maximum time a fighter pilot would have to shoot down a German bomber, given the speed of modern aircraft, was 2 seconds, and that nothing less than 8 guns would produce the weight of metal to do the job in that brief a time. And he oversaw and directed the design of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that would power his fighters and would eventually power the American P-51D as well. He not only thought of every detail, he fought for every detail. When the Air Minister objected to the expense of equipping his fighters with bulletproof windscreens, Dowding replied, "If Chicago gangsters can have bulletproof glass in their cars, I don't bloody well see why I can't have it in my Spitfires." There was no detail too small to engage Dowding's attention. A widower, dour and somewhat solemn in manner, with a son who was a fighter pilot, Dowding's nickname in the Royal Air Force, never used to his face, was Stuffy. But he had a remarkable soft spot for his fighter pilots, whom he referred to as his chicks, and whom he addressed as "my dear fighter boys," like a Mr. Chips in uniform. In the end, despite bruising fights with his fellow air marshals and with the Treasury, Dowding got what he wanted and had his system up and running by the summer of 1940, just in time to do battle with the Luftwaffe and prevented German invasion. But his greatest and most dramatic contribution to victory was not in the air battle, but in the cabinet room at number 10 Downing Street, where Dowding and Churchill clashed at a meeting of the War Cabinet on May 15, 1940, and where Dowding's stubborn opposition may very well have saved Britain. It had been only 5 days since the king had asked Churchill to form a government, and also only 5 days since the German attack in the West. 2 days before, the Germans had overrun neutral Holland and destroyed the undefended city of Rotterdam, causing thousands of civilian casualties. They were now advancing fast into neutral Belgium. Further to the south, the German army had reached and crossed the Meuse River, and Churchill had been woken early that morning by a call in English from French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, who said, "We have been defeated. We have lost the battle. The Germans have broken through at Sedan. The way to Paris is open." Churchill, a lifelong sincere Francophile despite his awful French, flew to Paris that same day and was confronted not only with the French government's alarming panic and pessimism, but by desperate pleas for the British to send more fighter squadrons to France. The French point of view was simple. Britain's small army was already in retreat towards the Channel ports. The French were being overwhelmed. The Luftwaffe controlled the sky. Now or never was the time to send in Britain's whole fighter force. Churchill eventually gave in and asked the War Cabinet to agree to send 10 more fighter squadrons to France. There is a wonderful account by General Ismay, Churchill's chief of staff, of their being driven late at night from the British embassy in Paris, where they were staying, to Premier Reynaud's apartment to give him the glad news that the fighters were on the way, and of Churchill's grumbling at being kept waiting in Reynaud's living room without noticing that there was a woman's fur coat and negligee thrown over one of the chairs and a pair of high-heel shoes and stockings on the rug, until Reynaud finally appeared in his pajamas and silk dressing gown, leaving his mistress, the formidable Countess Hélène de Porte, whom one wit described as the only man in the French cabinet, to listen from behind the bedroom door. 3 days later, at a crucial meeting of the British War Cabinet, Dowding confronted the Prime Minister over the question of sending more Hurricanes to France, putting his own career at stake by arguing vehemently against it, until Churchill reluctantly gave in. It was a moment of extraordinary drama. Holland had surrendered the day before. The news from Belgium made it clear that a Belgian surrender was imminent. The British Expeditionary Force, more than 250,000 men, was retreating towards Dunkirk and the Channel ports, and there were rumors that German tank forces were already within a day's march of Paris. With every fiber of his being, Churchill believed that France must be supported at whatever cost. With every fiber of his being, Dowding believed that France was already lost, and that Britain could not survive with less than the 50 squadrons of fighter planes to defend her that he needed, of which he now only had 36, and from which the Prime Minister proposed to take 10. Perhaps nothing in Dowding's career required more courage than to face a glowering, angry Churchill that day. But he succeeded in making his point, and when the Battle of Britain began, he had just the number of squadrons he needed. For 2 months, August and September, the survival of Britain rested on the men and women of Fighter Command. For the young women of the Royal Air Force Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAFs, operated the radar stations and Fighter Command's operation rooms without losing their nerve even under direct attack from German dive bombers. Young women defused unexploded German bombs from the runways, despite the fact that most German bombs contained timers and trembler fuses that made this a hazardous procedure. And young women pilots, some of them less than 19 years old, delivered new and repaired Spitfires and Hurricanes directly to squadrons that needed them. As for the young men who fought, young because 18 or 19 was the normal age of a fighter pilot, straight out of school, many of them, and the oldest fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain was 40 and considered something of a miracle. They included such extraordinary personalities as Douglas Bader, who had lost both his legs in an air crash, but still went on to command a squadron and shoot down 22 German aircraft. A Canadian ex-Mountie, a Las Vegas gambler, Billy Fisk, a wealthy American playboy and the former gold medal winning captain of the United States Olympic bobsled team, who would become the first American killed in action in World War II. A Czech sergeant, Josef František, who flew by himself because he could not understand or speak a single word of English, but who nevertheless shot down 17 German planes before he was killed himself. And the Americans, Red Tobin, a former MGM studio messenger, Shorty Keogh, a 5 foot, the shortest pilot in the Royal Air Force, who needed 2 inflatable Dunlop pillows to see over the instrument panel of his Hurricane, and Andy Mamedoff, a Jewish ex-barnstormer and stunt pilot from Miami. Britain was so short of fighter pilots that the 3 American pilots, Tobin, Keogh, and Mamedoff, who had tried to join first the Finnish Air Force, then the French, and had just managed to get out of France on the last Channel ferry, were spending the last of their pocket money in a pub across the street from the Air Ministry and explaining their predicament to a friendly air commodore at the bar, who bought them a drink and took them back to the Air Ministry across the street, got them commissioned as pilot officers, and gave them a cash advance on their pay to go out and buy uniforms immediately. In the morning, there had been 3 American civilians with pilot licenses. By the afternoon, they were in the Royal Air Force. Within 3 weeks, they were flying Hurricanes in battle, 3, 4, even 5 times a day. None of them survived. Young men arrived to join a fighter squadron straight from an operational training unit, were put into a fighter and scrambled before they had even unpacked, and were sometimes killed before anybody even knew their name. The station adjutant or the station warrant officer had to open their bags to find out who they had been. The learning curve for a fighter pilot was sudden and brutal. He stood almost no chance of surviving his first 3 missions. After that, his chances began to improve as he gained experience and confidence. Then, after 10 missions, the numbers took over again, and his chance of survival dropped to almost 0. For almost 3 months of continuous combat, the Luftwaffe sought daily to destroy Fighter Command, attacking the airfields in southern England over and over again, coming in waves of 100, 200, 300 bombers at a time. Some days, like August 15th, Adlertag, meant to be the biggest of the German attacks, strained Fighter Command to the point where Dowding was running short of pilots. Again and again, squadrons were reduced to only a few aircraft. Airfields were bombed to the point where they were no longer usable. The German invasion fleet was ready. The German army and navy were waiting for the signal that the sky over the channel in southern England had been swept clear at last of British fighters, and still Fighter Command fought on. The battle reached its peak in late August and early September. On September 15th, Churchill, who had come down to see the action from a seat in the gallery at number 11 Group's fighter control room at Uxbridge just outside London, watched the board as light after light turned red, indicating that a British squadron had engaged the enemy and was landing to refuel and rearm. "The odds were great," he wrote, "our margins small, the stakes infinite." The Prime Minister watched with increasing anxiety, and turning to Air Vice Marshal Park, the commander of number 11 Group, asked, "What other reserves have we?" "There are none," Park replied. Every aircraft, every pilot was engaged. There was nothing to spare. The fate of Britain was being decided by a small group of young men, many of them just out of operational training units, who had never fired their guns in anger before. Yet this day was the climactic moment of the battle, perhaps of the war, for German losses were so heavy that Hitler finally ordered that evening the indefinite postponement of Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England. And soon the great invasion fleet he had built up was sent back to the canals and rivers from which the barges and tugs had been taken. The winter storms swept in from the Atlantic, and the danger of invasion receded. The Blitz of London and other British cities, which would claim the lives of more than 50,000 British civilians, was yet to come. Thwarted in his attempt to invade Britain, Hitler would move his forces east and attack the Soviet Union instead. But September 15th, 1940, was as close as he ever would come to victory in World War II. A victory against the odds, which was won by a handful of young men in the air and of young men and women on the ground, and which is celebrated every year in Britain still today as Battle of Britain Day. On that day, every year, a carefully preserved Hurricane and Spitfire are flown down the Mall and over Buckingham Palace to celebrate the most crucial victory of the war, and to commemorate all those who fought and served in it, and whose stories, interwoven with those of their German opponents, I've tried to tell in With Wings Like Eagles. and whose spirit is best summed up by Winston Churchill himself, who said in 1940, "Never give in, never give in, never, 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 in nothing great or small, large or petty. Never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense." Not a bad rule for nations and politicians to follow. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I answer any questions? Those who have first novels, I have bad news. First of all, their questions will come out. Secondly, I'm retired, so all I can do is give you Simon Schuster's address. But, sir.
Was the British public at the time aware of how thin their defenses were, their air defenses?
Well, admittedly, I was a 7-year-old member of the British public. So, they were torn between two separate feelings. An enormous number of people, particularly in the Conservative Party, where on Neville Chamberlain's resignation, the Conservatives had hoped, as did the King, very strongly, that he would be replaced by Lord Halifax, then the Foreign Secretary. And Halifax, as early as September 26th, actually was talking to the Italian ambassadors to London. Italy was still neutral in the summer of 1940, about the possibility of Signor Mussolini, as he called him, inquiring of the Führer what terms Germany would offer for a British surrender. When Churchill learned this at the War Cabinet meeting of May 26, he was bouleversé, he was astonished, and deeply upset and disturbed, and argued, correctly I think, that any such exploration was, as he put it, stepping on the slippery slope from which there will be no coming back. And a very unpleasant scene occurred between Halifax and Churchill on this subject. And Churchill feared greatly that we were moving inexorably in that condition, in that direction. And that, late that afternoon, he met with the larger cabinet. The War Cabinet consisted of only 6 people. The larger cabinet was about 36 people. And they met him in his room in the House of Commons, which was very crowded. He had to stand on a small stool to look above them and talk. And he gave them an short inspirational off-the-cuff speech, at the end of which Hugh Dalton remembers Churchill saying, if our Long Island story is at last to end, then let it end when each of us is rolling on the ground, choking on his own blood. And they went mad. They clapped him on the back and they cheered. And it gave him both the internal conviction that Halifax was wrong, and also the sense of both Labour, Liberal, and Conservative politicians behind him in the House of Commons, solidly enough to go back to the War Cabinet meeting that night and tell Halifax that he must break off any discussions he was having with the Italian ambassador. So I think that small story indicates that the British were not of one unified mind. There was a substantial amount of people, particularly in the upper classes, who hoped for a decent settlement as opposed to a bloody invasion and an endless amount of destruction. The king was briefly one of them. And on the other hand, the king represents another point of view, because he wrote in a letter to his mother, Queen Mary, when he heard the news of France's surrender, "I am so relieved that we are alone now and have no ally to pamper and persuade." which represents another simultaneous English view. I think you have to imagine a country which, on the one hand, has no idea really how close they are to complete invasion and destruction, and on the other hand is torn between a sensible feeling that perhaps now is the time to talk to the Germans and see just how bad it would be to surrender, and a very British feeling, which is that nothing that happens on the other side of the English Channel can possibly affect us, and that in any case we always have to fight on to the end. There's a famous headline from a popular newspaper of the 1930s, which runs, "Dense fog in Channel, continents cut off." Events happen so swiftly that you must imagine to yourself that all these emotions were not only being felt at the same time, but were very often being felt by the same person. The same person could feel defiant, thrilled by our success in the air, terrified of invasion, anxious to know if it were possible to surrender on halfway decent terms, and feel all those emotions at intervals during the day. And I think that would be the fairest answer, that very few had Churchill's solid, absolute conviction that we must go on and that we would be victorious. We were getting nothing, to be perfectly candid, from the United States at the time. And it seemed unlikely they would ever end the war. And the only suggestion that came from there was a suggestion that FDR forwarded through Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister, that it would be useful if in the event the British were invaded and defeated, they guaranteed that they would send the British fleet across the Channel to Canadian and American ports rather than letting it fall into the hands of the Germans. And down at the bottom of this message, Winston Churchill has scrawled, "No, never. There can be no such discussion. We are going to win." And I think that that represents as rounded a picture as I can give you. Sir?
There's been talk that if the Luftwaffe hadn't diverted their attacks from the British airfield to the cities, that the Fire Command might not have been able to have the capacity to win the Battle of Britain.
Well, I think that's a key point. You're perfectly correct.
So I have two questions. One is, do you think that's true? And secondly, who was it that took that decision? Was it Hitler or was it Goebbels that diverted them?
You are going to have to speak louder than that because...
Do you think it's true that the diversion to the cities weakened, was one of the reasons why Fighting Command was able to win the Battle of Britain? And secondly, who took the German decision to divert the bombers from the British airfields to the cities? Was it Hitler or was it Goebbels?
This is a complex story, and I will try and reply as quickly as I can. Yes. Probably the... yes, to all of that. Yeah, probably the biggest mistake in the history of warfare, apart from Pickett's charge on the last day of Gettysburg, was the decision to divert the attack from Royal Air Force airfields in the south of England to London, Birmingham, and some of the other big cities of Britain. That was a disastrous mistake because the Germans were just on the verge of winning the struggle against Fighter Command. The moment they turned and began to attack the big cities during the day, Fighter Command was given a period in which to rebuild itself, and also there are other problems involved with it. London is such a big city that although it is impossible to miss it from an airplane, it's also very difficult in 1940 terms to do enough damage to an object that size that it will make any difference. Of course you will kill a number of school children, nuns, and old ladies having tea, but, and the cumulative effect of that may well be to depress people about the war, but a city the size of London is not going to be destroyed by any number of air raids. The reason why the Germans switched strategy is one of those peculiar things which goes to illustrate just why it is important not to get into wars. Because chance, luck, bad luck, human nature, and so forth affect every decision in war. A German flight of night bombers aiming at the Thames-side oil refinery and tanks down the Thames from London got lost and bombed the center of London, hitting a number of old monuments, all of them within the walls of the city of London. I hear that I can tell that you're English, or British anyway, so you know the city of London is the small commercial center. Churchill was outraged at this, and already as angry as it was possible to be at the Air Ministry. He had asked them how long they would require if he gave the order to bomb Berlin to actually do it, and they said 24 hours. So, hearing bombs falling upon Bobels and many other historic places, he gave them the 24-hour notice, and they sent a whole bomber force off to find Berlin. No easy task in the days when bombers flew at night, when they had no radar, when they were unable much of the time to even find the right city. But by luck or sheer accident, enough of them found Berlin to drop bombs on Berlin and killed 5 people. None of them of any significance, of course, but never mind. Since both the Führer and Reichsmarschall Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, had promised the Germans that whatever happened, no bombs would ever fall on them. And Goering had even announced in 1937, I believe, in a famous comment, he said, "If a bomb ever falls on Berlin, you can call me Meyer." All of a sudden, bombs are falling on Berlin, not doing any particular damage, but nevertheless, it was a major blow in terms of Nazi self-image and of Nazi promises to the German people. It became domestic politics. And so Hitler made a speech about a week later in the Sportpalast in Berlin to a huge crowd, and he ended it by shouting, "And if they bomb our cities, we will extirpate theirs." Now, the Luftwaffe, which is just on the verge of winning against the Royal Air Force, is obliged to switch its entire attack to the city of London. Difficult to do, not terribly effective, gives the Royal Air Force a chance to recover. But, as you will perceive, this is all a result of a mistake. There was never a German policy to bomb London in this instance. I'm not forgiving the Germans, you understand. But I'm merely saying that the one thing that the Luftwaffe was constantly reminded of was that it was the Führer's order and Reichsmarschall Goering's order that London was not to be bombed until they were told to do it. So even bombing the oval cricket pitch and the tennis courts at Wimbledon, which they did by accident, created a fury in the German high command and government, because although we don't think of them as being in the center of London, they're still within the greater limits of London. Then all of a sudden, their night bombers cheerfully managed to make a mistake of about 25 miles and blow up some historic churches in the city of London. Retaliation is directed against Berlin, as it rightly should have been, and before we know it, the war had changed in a radical way, and nothing was ever the same since. But I would agree that that decision probably cost the Germans the victory that was almost within their grasp, although they may not have known at that moment that it was. Sir?
I was just curious, as a pilot, over the years, have you had a chance to fly any of the aircraft from the Battle of Britain on either side?
No, I have flown in a Spitfire, a 2-seat. Some of them were converted to easier to do than say, to 2-seat trainers for the Irish Air Force after the war. 2 of which are still flying. If anybody cares to fly the Spitfire, there's one in England and one in California, converted to 2 seats for the Irish Air Force in 1946. Two of them are still left, and I believe it costs $5,000 to go up in them. But I would say it's worth it if you have $5,000 to spare. It's a great feeling. It's an indescribable feeling because it's tiny. It's very light for an airplane. It's very solid. It's kind of like if you could imagine a Jack Russell with 8 machine guns. But it is infinitely sensitive, so that the slightest movement, the slightest change of your weight moves the airplane radically more than you would expect it to. And it is like a child's sled equipped with a 1,200 horsepower motor. The power of the engine in comparison to the size of the airplane and the weight of the airplane is simply amazing. The only other unfortunate thing about it is that there are two characteristics about British fighter aircraft of the Second World War that are invidious. One is that they are incredibly noisy. It is truly deafening. And the other is that in order to save weight, they're built without a floor, which means, it meant during the battle, for example, that if you dropped a map, it went down to the bottom. Now, that was not considered a problem because fighter pilots hardly ever in 1940 needed a map. They did their navigating by flipping the plane upside down and looking down at the road pattern and saying, yes, that's Chipping Norton. So the problem of dropping a map, which is a big problem for bomber pilots, was in 1940 for fighter pilots not a realistic problem. But for example, if you drop your oxygen mask or your goggles, they were gone. They went straight down to the bottom of the airplane. So the other thing about it is that if the movement of the aircraft means going down to the bottom of the aircraft too. It's pretty exciting. I mean, if you like airplanes, for those who are not as enthusiastic about airplanes as I am, it wouldn't be a great phone. It's great to be up in them, but I've never flown one, no.
How did it compare with the Messerschmitt, the German?
Messerschmitt was
Fighter.
Messerschmitt was shorter, smaller. Had a tighter cockpit, which is hard to imagine, because when I tell you I guess then I was 5'7.5" I'm probably now 5'7" or 5'6.5" because we shrink with age, of course, in some directions at any rate. I found the Spitfire cockpit a fairly tight fit. Now, I'm not claustrophobic, and I don't, I like airplanes, but even so, you can't help feeling that you're pretty squeezed in pretty tight there. The Messerschmitt was much tighter, and also had a cockpit canopy, which instead of sliding back, opened this way, like a complete little metal and glass greenhouse, and which, when it was locked, pressed right against your head if you were more than about 5'6" tall. So it was an intensely uncomfortable plane. I must also add that all 1940s fighter aircraft did not have heated cockpits, neither the Messerschmitt nor the Hurricane nor the Spitfire. So at 25,000 feet, the temperature was somewhere between -30 and -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Although fighter pilots wore exactly that jacket, the Irvin jacket, designed by the same American who invented the commercial parachute, and built up a factory in England to produce those jackets on the parachutes. Most fighter pilots, during actual combat, sweat poured off them. Just poured off them. From the adrenaline, from the combination of fear, excitement, adrenaline rush, noise, speed, the tumult of airplanes all around them at high speeds of 300 or 400 miles an hour when they were diving, certainly. The controls were not in any way power operated, so you pulled against the control stick or against with force. It was like lifting weights, and when you kicked the rudder pedal, you kicked it with all your weight because you were constantly moving. When people are taught to fly, in all languages and all cultures, all flying instructors from the beginning of flight, before Blériot, have always said to their pupils, handle the controls gently as you would a woman. It's chauvinist and anti-feminist, but nevertheless, I'm sure even women are told that by flight instructors. So, because it's at the base of flight instructors, that everything has got to be handled gently and smoothly and without stress and carefully. None of that applied to flying a fighter plane in combat. You kicked with your whole weight on the rudder pedal. You hauled the stick over with all your force. You were flying at 400 miles an hour and using only your strength against the wind forces and the G-forces that control the moving surfaces of the aircraft. A friend of mine, old friend, who was a fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain and was still alive and wrote a wonderful book about it called At First Light. I think said it best and summed it up when he said, nothing you have ever experienced in life prepares you for mortal combat. You must always remember that if you fly straight and level for more than 20 seconds, you will be killed. So you must think of it as that epitomizes it all. If you fly straight and level for more than 20 seconds, you will be killed.
I think we have time for just one more quick question.
With the scarcity of the early Spitfires, how were they replaced as they were shot down?
Well, actually, among the many good things that Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain did were to build what were called shadow factories, so that each factory that produced the Hurricane, say, or the Spitfire or the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine had an exact equivalent deeper in England. Therefore, if the first one was bombed, the second one could go on producing. The second is that Lord Beaverbrook, who was Minister of Aircraft Production, set up a wonderful thing called the Civilian Repair Units, in which civilians, men and women, in big hammers, were brought by young women driving Scamo lorries. They were called primaries because they were so big. They picked up the damaged Hurricanes and Spitfires and the ones that had been shot down. They picked them up and they brought them at the end of every day to the nearest civilian repair organization, and they stripped these aircraft apart, and from the parts they produced new aircraft, which the young women then in the morning flew back to the fighter station. So there was this constant coming and going of bits and pieces being turned back into aircraft. Dowding never ran seriously short of aircraft. He often felt short of aircraft, which is different. There is no general that ever feels he has enough airplanes or tanks or anything else. But it's indicative of that on most days the Germans assumed that Dowding had around 200 to 250 fighters. There was never a day on which he dropped below 700. And 700 was enough. Not too much, but just enough.